Welcome to episode 30 of the 3am Fear podcast. Would you ever buy a house with a dark secret, knowing its history? Rob and Vicki Graves purchased Foxhollow Farm. Excited to start a new chapter in their lives, they were eager to settle into this new home. However, almost immediately after moving in, strange occurrences began to take place. The story of Foxhollow Farm begins in the early 2000s in Hamilton County, Indiana. The sprawling estate had a history that went back several decades. But it was the events of the last few years that had made it infamous. It all started with the purchase of the property by Herb Baumeister, a successful businessman and entrepreneur. Herb purchased the property in 1988. Herb had made his fortune by running a chain of thrift stores, and he was well known for his charming personality and affable demeanor. On the surface, he appeared to be a successful businessman and a family man. But beneath the surface, he struggled with his sexuality, mental health issues, and also had a dark, secret life. Herb had a fascination with death and the macabre. He would often visit gay bars and pick up men, many of whom would later disappear without a trace. The bodies of several young men were later found buried under his property. But before Herb could be brought to trial, he committed suicide in 1996 by shooting himself in the head. The property was later sold to a new owner who quickly discovered that the estate was haunted. Strange occurrences and supernatural phenomena plagued the new owner, and many believe that there are several restless spirits still roaming the grounds of Foxhollow Farm. Hello and welcome to the 3am Fear podcast. I'm Nikita Ferrao, mystery and thriller author. On this podcast, I talk about real crimes and real people. Due to the graphic nature of some of this content, listener discretion is advised. You can find the episode show notes on my website 3amfear.com. Let's get started. You can check out the book The Haunting of Foxhollow Farm, which was written by Richard Estep and Robert Graves. Richard Estep is a paranormal investigator, and you will hear the story of Robert Graves in this episode. Now, Robert Graves is said to be one of the persons who lived in Foxhollow Farm and had the chance to experience some of this paranormal phenomena. The Haunting of Foxhollow Farm will be divided into 2 episodes. The first will narrate the story of Rob and Vicki Graves, who purchased this property a decade after Herb Baumeister killed himself. And in the second episode, we'll go through the story of Herb Baumeister. A decade after Herb Baumeister killed himself, new owners Rob and Vicki Graves purchased Foxhollow Farm. Excited to start a new chapter in their lives, they were eager to settle into this new home. However, almost immediately after moving in, strange occurrences began to take place. In 2006, Rob and Vicki Graves had enough of the fast-paced city life and decided to escape to the suburban Indiana. They wanted a place where they could relax and enjoy a slower pace of life. They began looking for properties in the nicer suburbs of Indiana and stumbled across a listing for a property called Foxhollow Farm. The sprawling estate was listed at an unbelievably cheap price, and the Graves were intrigued. They contacted a real estate agent who agreed to give them a tour of the property. Although it seemed too good to be true, they decided to keep an open mind and see the property for themselves. When they first arrived at Foxhollow Farm, they were immediately struck with its beauty. The property was everything they had been looking for. A sprawling estate with plenty of space for their family to spread out and relax. Rob and Vicky were strolling around the property that the real estate agent had brought them to see. As they walked, they started discussing about the house and the land that it sat on. But as they continued, Rob began to notice something peculiar about the place. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks, and a look of realization spread across his face. "I think I've heard of this place on TV before," he said to Vicky, who looked at him equally puzzled. This could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Herb Baumeister, Rob continued. Vicky's eyes widened in shock as Rob explained what exactly he remembered about Herb. He had heard the name Fox Hollow Farm on a true crime show, and the pieces were falling in place. This was the exact same property where Herb Baumeister committed his crimes. Rob quickly interrupted the real estate agent and asked if this exact property belonged to Herb Baumeister. The agent confirmed his suspicion. The real estate agent knew that the couple would eventually ask about the property. The agent took a deep breath before giving them an answer they were expecting. The agent said, quote, "In the 90s, an investor purchased this property after a tragedy had occurred. A man named Herb Baumeister had lived here and killed almost 24 young men, burying them in this property." End quote. The agent further went on to say that the investor had completely gutted the estate, removed any remnants of what it used to look like. Despite its beauty and great condition, no one was willing to purchase the home because of its history. Investigators were still finding pieces of bone on the property, and they weren't sure exactly how many victims were there. The property had also become kind of a spooky place to live. People believed that there were ghosts around. The couple's faces showed their shock and horror at the revelation. The agent finished the explanation by stating, quote, "That's why the price is so low. The property is beautiful and well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history." End quote. The agent noticed the couple's discomfort upon hearing the history of the property. Quote, "Why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this." End quote, he suggested. Despite their initial hesitation, the couple ultimately decided to buy the property. A couple of weeks later, Rob, Vicky, and their 2 teenage sons moved into Fox Hollow Farm. They loved their new home and especially enjoyed the swimming pool. But their sons had a habit of running around outside. They would track in dirt and gravel into the pool. One day, while vacuuming the mess, Vicky's vacuum suddenly stopped working. The power cord had come undone from the outlet. Assuming she had accidentally yanked the cord out, Vicky plugged it back in. But as she started vacuuming again, the cord came undone once more. This time, she noticed something strange. The plug didn't look like it had been pulled out. In fact, it looked like someone had deliberately disconnected it. As she continued to vacuum, Vicky kept an eye on the outlet, checking to see if the connection was stable. Suddenly, she saw the power cord pop out once again. This time, it didn't simply fall on the ground. It shot out of the socket with a force that startled her, as if there was a surge of electricity that caused it. Shocked, Vicky dropped the vacuum and left wondering what could have happened. At the car dealership where Rob worked, he had an employee named Joe who was constantly late. One day, Rob confronted Joe about why was he always late. Joe said that he lived over an hour away and was struggling to make it to work on time. Rob offered to rent out an apartment that was attached to his residence at Fox Hollow Farm, which had been vacant to Joe. Joe was interested in this offer, and few days later, Rob helped Joe move in. They spent the entire day moving Joe's belongings into the apartment, and Joe was left exhausted by the end. With only his dog Fred for company, Joe went to bed and quickly fell asleep. That night turned out to be a nightmare for Joe. He had a dream that someone was chasing him, and he woke up in panic. Half asleep, he jumped out of bed and started running around the apartment, trying to escape. He banged the door frame and knocked over a glass, cutting his hand pretty badly. When he finally came to, he was disoriented and confused, wondering what had just happened. A couple of days later, Vicky came home and found Rob painting on the side of the house. As they admired the beauty of the house, Vicky noticed a man standing on the edge of their property, wearing a red t-shirt. The man was just standing there, looking at the property. As Vicky looked at him, he turned around and walked away, disappearing into the forest. She was startled by the man's sudden appearance and disappearance, but before she could say anything to Rob, the man was gone. She couldn't shake this feeling that something was not right. She just couldn't put a finger on it. She immediately called out to Rob, telling him what she had just seen. Rob tried to calm her down, reminding her that they were living in the house that belonged to a killer once, and that people were bound to come and check out who was living there now. They walked over to where Vicky had earlier seen the man, but no one was there. Later that night, Joe was doing his dishes in his apartment when he heard a knock on the door. With wet hands, he called out for the person to wait a moment. As he dried his hands, the knocking grew louder and more aggressive. When he finally opened the door, no one was there. He was immediately on guard, wondering if someone was there on the roof or maybe hiding. He stepped out onto the front steps, looking around for any signs of a prankster or burglar. But he found none. As he went back into the apartment, he shut the door, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw a man in his bedroom, just walking past the door frame. It startled him, and his dog started growling, looking in the direction of the bedroom. He cautiously walked over and looked into the bedroom, but there was nothing there. He flipped on all the lights and searched the room, trying to figure out what was going on. He was scared to death. As Joe had recently moved into this apartment, he had developed a habit of taking his dog, Fred, for a walk along the well-lit driveway in the evenings. But after this unsettling experience of hearing the knocking on the door and then seeing this man in his bedroom, he decided to forego the walk with his dog and instead clear his head. He thought that maybe he could swing by Rob and Vicky's house to see if the lights were on. This could indicate that maybe it was one of them knocking, and maybe they thought that he was busy and left. As he approached their house, he noticed that it was completely dark, indicating that they had fallen asleep. Just then, his dog stopped in its track, sensing something was amiss. Fred broke free from the leash and ran towards the tree line. Joe watched as his furry companion disappeared into the darkness. Before he could react, he saw a man in a red shirt at the edge of the forest. The man had his back towards Joe and was walking into the woods. Joe watched as the man in red vanished into the forest. and he felt a chill run down his spine. Joe had to save his dog. He ran towards the woods, following Fred's barks. As he ran, he realized that the man in red had disappeared. Fred was no longer barking, and when Joe found him, the dog was cowering and facing away from him. Joe turned to look back at him, and to his horror, there was the man standing right there, staring at him. Joe was terrified and froze in fear for a few seconds before he turned around and ran as fast as he could. Fred followed closely behind, and they both ran back into Joe's apartment, where they locked the door and closed the blinds. Joe sat there, panting and sweating, wondering what had just happened. He couldn't shake off the image of that man in red, standing there, staring at him. Joe spent the entire night checking his windows and looking outside, unsure of what he had seen. Was that real or a figment of his imagination? He had experienced a strange sequence of events, from the knocking on the door to the ghostly figure in his apartment, and now this man in red. The next morning, Joe finally mustered the courage to tell Rob and Vicky about his strange encounter. He recounted the details of the previous night, including the man in red that he had seen in the streets. As he spoke, Vicky's demeanor grew increasingly emotional. Quote, "I saw a man in red too," end quote, she said, pointing to the same area where Joe had described this man. Quote, "Right over there. What's going on?" End quote, she asked. Joe was on the edge that night after all the terrifying events that had happened. He was listening intently for any strange noises coming from the outside. He decided not to go on this usual walk. Suddenly, there was a loud knocking on the door. Joe yelled out, asking who was there, but he received no answer. The knocking continued, the knocker on the door visibly shaking from the force. Joe cautiously opened the door, but found no one. He looked at the knocker, which was perpendicular to the ground, as if someone was holding it up, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the knocker swung down, hitting the door one last time. Joe quickly slammed the door shut and locked it, feeling absolutely petrified. As he stood there, he could hear the doorknob slowly turning. He watched in horror as it twisted all the way over into the open position, even though the door was locked. There was a silence for a moment before the door suddenly burst open, the lock breaking with its force. Joe was shaking with fear, his heart racing. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew he needed to tell Rob and Vicky. He quickly ran out of his apartment to see who was doing this, but there was no one in sight. As he turned around to look back at his apartment, he saw a man in white who was soaked from head to toe. Screaming and running towards him, the man ran past him and vanished into thin air. Joe quickly grabbed his dog and raced to Vicky and Rob's apartment to tell them what was happening. The couple were equally frightened by Joe's experience. They convinced themselves that the ghosts that they were dealing with had to be Herb Baumeister's victims. Perhaps they were trapped in the house and were having their lives snuffed out by him. They believed that the man in white that Joe saw was a victim who possibly had escaped from Herb Baumeister. They knew that they needed a story to make sense of what was happening to them. The situation was currently impossible to understand. They went online and started researching the case, And that's when they came across the images of Herb Baumeister's victims. As they scrolled through the pictures, Joe suddenly stopped on one and exclaimed, quote, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." End quote. This confirmed to them that the entity that they were experiencing was the spirit of one of Herb Baumeister's victims. They felt scared but also reassured that they had identified the issue. The trio started aggressively researching the Baumeister case and soon discovered that there were likely more than one victim here. This only lent more credibility to the idea that the property was haunted by victims of Herb Baumeister. And we know exactly how many victims were there. Hundreds of them. After a few days of relative quiet, Joe decided to take a walk in the woods. This is the same area where Vicky had seen the man in red a few days earlier. Joe said that he was just going for a walk with his dog, and he set off in the direction of the woods. As he walked along the trail, he spotted something laying to the ground, almost directly in his path. It was a human femur bone, just sitting there among the leaves. Joe was shocked. How could this bone have gone unnoticed during the extensive searches of the property? It seemed to him like someone had left it there for him to find. He couldn't shake this feeling that the man in red, whom they believe was the victim of Herb Baumeister, had kept this bone there for him to find. Joe, Rob, and Vicky all believed that the bone is from another victim and it was yet to be identified. They thought that it might belong to the man in red. They decided to call the lead detective from the Baumeister case and tell him what they had found. The bone was then submitted for forensic analysis and taken in as evidence. Rob wanted to get a better understanding of the property and where they had found the bone. So he reached out to the lead investigator of the Baumeister case. He asked if the investigator was willing to visit the property and explain what tragedies had occurred and where were the victims buried. The investigator agreed and soon arrived at the property. He showed Rob, Joe, and Vicky the area where Baumeister had lured his young men to come in swimming, the same area where he would strangle them to death. The swimming pool was adorned with mannequins dressed in party outfits, a disturbing detail that added to the eerie atmosphere. The investigator then explained that a majority of the killings had taken place in the swimming pool area. Baumeister's victims had met their gruesome end right there. The mannequins were a chilling reminder of the twisted mind of a psychopath. As they listened to the investigator's account, the three couldn't help but feel a sense of horror and unease. It was the end of a hard day. Joe had just settled into his apartment after a long day of work. He sat down on his computer to catch up with some work, but his focus was interrupted by a strange sound. He heard a metallic scraping coming from the kitchen. He got up and headed towards the source of the sound. As he reached the kitchen, he found that all the knives that were usually in his butcher's block were now lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink. Joe was confused. He knew that he hadn't put them there. He turned to go back to his workstation, but noticed fresh cut marks on the island in front of him. There were quite a few of them, and they looked like they were made by a knife. Joe immediately thought of the victims of the serial killer. He had earlier been researching about them, and also the inspector had told him a lot. Joe decided to record a voice memo on his iPhone, hoping to capture any sounds or voices that might be present in the room. He turned off the TV and AC to ensure that the recording would be clear. He then started asking questions to the room, hoping to get some answers about what happened there. He asked if anyone was there, but there was only silence. When he asked who had been in the kitchen, his dog started growling, which made him feel even more uneasy. He took the phone back to his computer and downloaded the audio file. As Joe listened to the audio file he had just recorded, he was stunned by what he had just heard. After asking if there was anyone in the kitchen, he had received a response. "Who keeps walking in the kitchen? Who's in the kitchen?" The voice said, quote, "The married one." End quote. This was confusing because every single victim of Herb Baumeister was not married, was single. As he sifted through the case files, he discovered that the only person who was married in all these murders was none other than Herb Baumeister himself. Joe couldn't believe it. He realized that it was not the victims who were haunting the property, but Herb Baumeister himself. The discovery sent chills down his spine, and he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the property held. Despite the fear he felt, he was determined to uncover the truth. The truth about what happened on that land. He knew he had stumbled onto something significant, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. With this, we come to the end of part 1 of The Haunting of Fox Hollow Farm. In the next episode, I'll take you back to the story of Herb Baumeister and what happened to him. When I came across the book, The Haunting of Fox Hollow Farm, that's when I came to know about Herb Baumeister. This episode is a complete recap of that book. I'm of course not going to narrate every single thing in the book, but I'm sure you got the idea of what happened to the 3 who lived in this house, unfortunately, after Herb Baumeister died. I will link the book in the description. You can always check it out. It has a lot more information than what's there in this episode. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. It really helps me reach new listeners. If you have a true crime story or a case that you'd like me to cover on a future episode, please send in an email. I'll link it in the description. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the 3am Fear podcast so you do not miss any future episodes. You can find my YouTube and social media links in the description box so you're always updated on what I'm up. If you love thrillers, I have a free thriller ebook listed in the description. Do check it out. Until then, stay kind and stay safe out there. See you next week.